I'm recording this on the 9th of November 2016. Last night, the Americans decided to vote for Donald Trump, making him the first president in recent US history to have fought against every establishment in the country and override them to become president. The old Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza once wrote in the 17th century, "There are times when we should neither laugh nor cry, but understand." And I think this is apposite to discuss what has happened in the United States. For those who think or thought that Trump represented a new wave of fascism, that is what some people wrote, this then must be the worst possible day in history since 1933, when Adolf Hitler was elected in Germany. But I don't think Trump is a fascist. I never did. If you did think so, then you must be in despair because fascism has taken the White House, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and this new fascist government is going to appoint fascist judges to the Supreme Court. I don't believe any of this. I think in Trump we have seen the victory of a demagogic, right-wing populist politician who utilized all the weaknesses of his opponents, both inside the Republican Party and the Democrats, to rise to power. So what does Trump represent? What Trump did in this election campaign was to argue that the fat cats and the Wall Street bankers and the mainstream politicians had let the people of the United States down, and he talked openly about white American working class citizens, appealed to them, appealed to their needs very bluntly and demagogically, but not incorrectly, as it turned out. He said that he would defend them against the bankers, that what had happened during 2008 had not been remedied, and I think this is the heart of the problem, that Obama's victory in 2008, which many had hoped would lead to large-scale reforms, democracy, this, that, and the other, ended up as a disaster. Apart from a modest stimulus, effectively what Obama did was to bail out the banks, which had let the people down, and did nothing else apart from a healthcare system which was deeply flawed from the beginning, as some of us pointed out, and left the ordinary citizen and the poor citizens in particular too dependent on both bureaucracy as well as the pharmaceuticals and the insurance companies. And that is beginning to unravel as well. But more fundamentally, nothing was really done to deal with the economic crisis that had created 2008, or the institutions responsible for it. And so we saw throughout the world, not just in the United States, a whole new layer of politicians, both from the left and the right, who challenged this and said something had to be done because the conditions of everyday life for working people, the poor, and others were such that they were becoming completely alienated from the system. And this appeal to a layer which is not paid sufficient attention in any North American or European country is what is resulted in a Trump victory. And I think to try and ignore this fact and to say that really the problem is that there's been a big turn to racism and misogyny in the United States. Well, racism and misogyny has always existed in the United States, but it doesn't explain on its own how layers of the population, including large numbers of white workers, who voted for Obama, refused to vote for Clinton. Misogyny, to a certain extent, possible, but much, much deeper than that was a failure of Clinton to relate to this particular social layer. One of her own Democratic congressmen, trying to explain why she lost Pennsylvania, came up with the following argument. It's surprising, but Mrs. Clinton winning Philadelphia and its upscale suburbs was clearly not enough to offset the record losses among white blue-collar voters in the rest of the state. There is no question the Democratic Party needs to do a much better job in reaching out to those voters who once used to be reliably Democratic. This is one of her own supporters speaking. And so it's beginning to dawn on the liberal establishment, which backed Hillary full hilt without any criticisms at all, that they are partially responsible for their own defeat. Living in a bubble world, living in a world in which they are not used to dealing with real dissent, led them to a situation where they almost believed that by voluntarism, sheer will of propaganda, they would win the election. They didn't come close to it. Trump won a lot of the swing states easily, Florida and Ohio in particular, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the list goes on. But there's a deeper problem apart from this which has to be seen, and that is a very deep cancer at the heart of modern liberalism today. That since the 90s, since the birth and emergence of this particular form of capitalism under which we live, and which is referred to as neoliberalism to give it a new tag, but which is capitalism all the same, and which is concerned with making profits, but nowadays concerned with making profits with no regard for people who are less well off. They have no regard for them at all. And so they imagine living inside a bubble, cocooned from reality, that they can get away with it endlessly. Well, what the Trump triumph, unprecedented in the 20th and the 21st century, reveals is you can't get away with it all the time. And I think there are many lessons to be learned. For the Democrats, they must be now regretting, or I hope they are, they should be, that all the excrement poured on Bernie Sanders' head, all the sabotage that they carried out of his campaign, attempts to deny him proper time on television, slanders, attacking his age. I can't even be bothered to go through them. People can check it out if they want. But every single opinion poll was showing, even through the US primary campaign, that if Sanders had been the candidate of the Democratic Party, he would have won. Now, we don't know, of course, and we'll never know, because in their wisdom, John Podesta and the Democratic National Committee decided that they were going to go for Hillary Clinton come what may. And it came. It is now upon us. And we are now in the land of the unknown, only in the sense that Trump is not beholden either to Wall Street or to the establishments of either the Republican Party, to which he nominally belongs, or, far from it, the Democrats. It could have been avoided with a Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren ticket. Would have been a very strong ticket, but it was too radical. too radical from the left for the Liberals. And now they've got someone from the right. And they'll have to learn to work with him. Because this notion that Trump somehow represents a danger, unpredictable, slightly crazy. We've had presidents before who were plucked out of nowhere and planted in the White House, unlike Trump, who had to do it all himself. And one of them was Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan learned his lines. They taught him his lines. They surrounded him with a Politburo of the most right-wing sectors of the US military and political establishment, and he went about and did his business. Sometimes he would land up in one South American country, not remember the name of the capital or the country, and say, I'm glad I'm in Guatemala, whereas actually he was in Honduras, or something like that. These mistakes were made all the time, till gradually he began to lose it a bit, and virtually everything had to be done for him. So it's not that we haven't had presidents like that, but Trump is not Reagan. Trump is, let's say, more contrarian than Reagan. And during the election campaign, he said that the United States should avoid unnecessary conflict, something he repeated in his acceptance speech. He said that he didn't want a big fight with Russia. This is something for which the liberal so-called internationalist currents have been building up for the last year now in Europe and North America. He said he would end NAFTA. I mean, on all these 3 points, as was revealed when I was talking on this show with Thomas Frank a few weeks ago, he was ahead of her, really. Despite being on the right, he was ahead of her, more advanced. It seems obvious, but one can never be sure that Trump is going to lose. And yet, he is the person all over the world, Europe, Africa, Asia, on whom attention is focused, whereas Senator Clinton or Secretary Clinton is virtually ignored. People know who she is, they don't like her, or they like her, whatever the reasons, but Trump is the one on whom attention is concentrated. Yeah. Why?
People are absolutely obsessed with this man. I think there's a horror of him. You know, people can't believe this is happening, you know. The people all over the world who follow American politics are just horrified. And it's only accelerated, so it's, my metaphor is like, this is how many icebergs does this Titanic have to hit before it goes down? I mean, he's had blunder after blunder after blunder, and, you know, he's basically shot all his toes off, you know. He's down to one or two. He still keeps going. Exactly. He still keeps going. He says he's not going to withdraw. People are going to vote for him. He's going to carry some states, which is, you know, unthinkable.
But the other side of him is this, you know, the serious side, if we can call it that, which is that he has often attacked Clinton's dependence on Wall Street. He has attacked NAFTA. He has defended the interests of the poor white sections of the working class. He has said that he's going to reindustrialize the United States. So apart from the, you know, disaster side of him, in terms of what he's actually saying, surely that too must have an impact.
Yes. Well, the three things that you just mentioned are what makes him, what has given him this following that he has. And let's not forget, he beat all the other Republican challengers. These were very mainstream Republicans, many of them. And he clobbered them. There is huge enthusiasm for this guy. So there is a movement out there behind Trump.
But whether Trump is going to push through any of these measures remains to be seen. Because one mustn't forget, in the excitement or despair created by his victory, that he is the president of the world's largest imperial power, the strongest ever in global history, and he has his responsibilities to the imperial system. Now, of course, he can determine, together with the military, where how the best interests of the United States are served. And there is, of course, a strong establishment argument put forward by the realists inside the US establishment that these wars in the Middle East have been a disaster, unnecessary, that they've enhanced and increased terrorism rather than fighting it, and the sooner the United States disentangles from these wars, the better for the United States and, by extension, better for the world. There is this argument that has been going on in the US establishment, whether he'll have the guts to pursue it. So there is no need, in my opinion, for all the identical grief that has been displayed by the liberal media. I mean, if you were to read Friedman in the New York Times, Friedland in The Guardian, Paul Krugman in the New York Times again, and sundry others, it's the same thing: shock, horror, grief. Krugman is in despair. Friedland is saying Trump's election has made the United States a very dangerous state. What do they think the United States was before Trump? Not dangerous for large parts of the world? Just look at the history, and not just recent history, the history over the last 150 years, to see what was happening to this state, how this empire was created and built. It was dangerous, mostly to the rest of the world, especially its neighbors in South America, but equally, to a certain extent, to its own working people, who have been crushed and repressed before. So this notion that Trump is somehow much worse than everything that has happened before doesn't ring true. It simply doesn't. So why the shock and horror? The shock and horror comes because Trump's victory represents a huge defeat and setback for the liberal establishment that has run the United States for a long time, that has run Europe for a long time. One can date it from the Second World War, and how the same liberal establishment embraced conservative values laid down by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 80s and the 90s. And so there was no difference left between the liberal and conservative establishments, something I've written about and called the extreme center, because it didn't matter which of them won, whether it was Thatcher or Blair, whether it was Reagan or Bush or Clinton or Obama. The same policies were continued domestically and globally. Will Trump change these policies? It remains to be seen. Is he going to construct a wall with Mexico? We shall see. I doubt it. I think there was a lot of election demagogy. Is he going to make up with Putin? That might happen, and might not be such a bad thing after all, to decrease the tensions in Europe. Is he going to pull out of the Middle East and Afghanistan? Dismantle the 7 wars that Obama has been waging during his presidency? We shall see. The point I'm trying to make is that building him up into this ogre and demon doesn't serve anyone. It's incorrect, it doesn't make sense, and it prevents people from understanding the real problems that lie at the heart of United States society, and of course, by extension, in Europe, because the way the systems are run differ, of course, but fundamentally, they are the same. So if you want to sum up this experience, we have to do 2 things. First, this is not a triumph of American fascism. Second, it is a huge defeat for the old way of doing politics and for the liberal establishment. And this liberal establishment was supported by swathes of the mainstream media in the United States. The Democrats blew it themselves by insisting that the only possible candidate they had was Hillary Clinton, and for the legacy of Obama. Now, I have been a fierce critic of Obama, more or less since he came to power. I was never taken in or deceived. I accepted that psychologically, not politically, psychologically it was useful for the United States to have a mixed-race president married to an African-American woman descended from slaves, and it would be good if they were in the White House just to break the jinx, so to say it could never happen. But in terms of politics, Obama has been a disaster. He is the president who arrogated to himself, and which no other president is likely to give up, the right of a US president to order the execution of an American citizen without any trial. Once a committee has decreed that citizen X or citizen Y or citizen Z represents a danger to the security of the state, and to leave him or her alive would be damaging, the president can order a drone attack or an execution. This was Barack Obama. The number of drone attacks in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, increased during Obama's reign in office. The utterly slavish attitude to both Saudi Arabia and Israel, which defines US policy for some time, was thrown into some relief by Obama during the Saudi invasion of a neighboring country, Yemen, and the atrocities which it is carrying out there, even as I speak. Atrocities supported by Obama, supported by the European Union, supported by 100 Labour MPs in the British Parliament who refused to vote to condemn Saudi Arabia's war in the Yemen and voted with the Conservatives. All this is liberalism. That is what they do. So add to that the total failure of both America and Europe to change anything domestically after the 2008 crash, and you begin to see on a map what has been happening. There were two reactions to this in the United States. One was Bernie Sanders, which was a campaign from the left, which Bernie himself described as socialism, but let's call it a modest version of social democracy. Still very important. Huge turnouts. Hundreds of thousands of people who were prepared to be mobilized behind Bernie to fight Trump or whoever the Republican nominee was, but who wouldn't turn out in the same numbers for Hillary Clinton because they didn't trust her. She has a record which is appalling and abysmal in terms of corruption, the Clinton Foundation, in terms of wars, supporting the coup in Honduras, the war in Libya, where Clinton said, after one of the worst lynchings in history, that of Muammar Gaddafi, Clinton, when reporting the event, said, "We came, we saw, he died." And people then forgot all this in a misty haze of we will have our first woman president. As the actor Susan Sarandon said, we've had women leading countries before, and of course there have been. So the notion that gender transcends all is a dangerous notion. In terms of politics. It's not in terms of identity politics, but then identity politics has no solution to the problem of class, as we saw in the United States election a few days ago. And this campaign from Sanders was defeated, vilified, destroyed by the Democratic National Committee. So if you want to blame someone, blame yourselves. And don't blame the mirror if your own face is ugly. Similar processes are at work in Europe. The extreme center parties are in a crisis. Francois Hollande, the president of France, is on 4%, 4%, and still insisting on contesting the presidency. The extreme right National Front, I think she veers between 28 and 30%. In Germany, new far-right parties have come to the fore. And in Britain, we had a similar experience to the Sanders experience in the US, with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the British Labour Party against the will and campaigning of the entire media, with the BBC in the lead, with reports that bordered on slander. But Corbyn won. He won the leadership of the party. Had Corbyn not won, it is perfectly likely that we would have had a huge further growth of UKIP, which is not too dissimilar to Trump in many ways. So the fact that Labour has got a radical leader should be taken advantage of, and at the very least his own party should back him, otherwise they will suffer the fate of the Democrats in the United States of America. And the reasons, as I've been arguing, for both these developments in Europe and North America are not dissimilar. European politics, ever since the 90s, has followed the United States. Two parties, part of the same establishment, hardly doing anything differently. Movements from the left, which we've seen, either committing suicide like Syriza in Greece, or struggling on in a confused way like Podemos in Spain, or electing Corbyn leader of the Labour Party as we've seen in Britain. Movements of the right, in some ways much tougher, much stronger, rising in Germany, rising in France, Italy in a state of crisis, semi-permanent. So what is the future? The future is what many people were arguing at the end of the primary campaign in the United States. And this now becomes something which is of importance. There is a desperate need in the United States for a third party, a radical party which promotes progressive ideas, which is open and free to people on the left or people who just want something very different, which is not a sectarian party, but which offers a real alternative. My worry is that given the triumph of Trump, many progressives in the United States will not learn the lessons of the Trump victory, but will actually say we should have been more supportive of Hillary. Now that would be a disaster, were this to be the dominant view. Because what American history shows us now over the last 50 years is the desperate need for something else. It's not an easy task. One knows all the difficulties. But Eugene Debs' Socialist Party in the early years of the last century offers a model of something that could be built, possibly on the level of cities or statewide, ultimately nationally. It's a long, long struggle ahead, but unless this is understood, we will carry on in the Tweedledee, Tweedledum mode, bemoaning this loss and that loss, exaggerating the awfulness of the opposing candidates, etc. Many of us argued that neither Trump nor Clinton were the candidates one should support, and I particularly argued in favor of giving the Greens a vote and abstaining in the main election. Nothing that has happened has made me change my view.